Good morning, or afternoon, or evening. This is the Paperback Warrior Podcast. My name is Eric, and I'm your host today for another rock solid episode. Now, this podcast pairs beautifully with the blog paperbackwarrior.com, where you can read a slew of reviews and articles, as well as play every single episode of this show right there. There's a donation link in the top right-hand corner of the desktop version, so feel free to throw some loose change in the old tip jar. Now, you remember how excited I was last month to talk about pulp and Western author Philip Ketchum. Remember the 3 solid days of research I did for that feature? It pales in comparison to the long journey I took for today's feature on author Steve Fisher. I'm telling you, I lost track of the hours spent scrolling through list upon list of stories and novels by this guy. But I'm excited because the end result came out spectacular, and this one's going to be massive. Now, my review this week is also going to be a Steve Fisher novella called Storm on the Island. And I also have a recording this week from Tom that he sent me from Saudi Arabia, and I'm going to play that for you. He's reviewing the new Starkhouse press release called Crime Cop by Lorenz Heller. I think that's going to be exciting. So before we get into the feature and all that jazz, let me tell you about 2 shopping trips I took. 2 shopping trips. Normally I just do one, but this time I got 2. So listeners, every time I head south to Orlando, my wife and I, we pass through the Daytona Beach Flea Market. It's kind of right off the side of the road, off of Interstate 95 south. And you can see it from the interstate. It's like this really large thing. And on a Saturday, the place is just like absolutely packed with people. And I generally don't like flea markets, but book shopping, really isn't that great at those places. So I was hoping maybe it would be different this time. So on this trip down, we had some extra time. So we finally decided to, kind of plunge into this Daytona Beach flea market. And this was on a Friday morning. Almost immediately upon entering one of the buildings, we saw a sign for books. All caps, large sign. So we headed that way. And there's an older guy named Vic there that runs Vic's Books. And it's not like a room or anything. It's kind of like 12 large shelving units, like floor to ceiling, filled with books. And they take up like a hallway and a corner of one of the buildings. He has a lot of books. Now, the left side is just all hardback books, and they're mostly in good condition. In the hardback section, I found a great selection of Clive Cussler books. And if I collected hardbacks, this shelf of Clive Cussler books would look awesome in my office. And he had new and older Stephen King hardbacks there, and I ended up buying Joe Hill's Strange Weather short story collection. It's a hardback published in 2017 by an imprint of HarperCollins called Morrow, or I guess William Morrow to be specific. This is a collection of 4 stories or novellas, and it really looks good. I'm excited to read it. He had several John Saul hardbacks, kind of an old name from the past. John Saul, really popular horror author in the 70s and 80s, and I guess early 90s. But he had Guardian there, which is one of his horror novels that I've always wanted to read. It has a great cover. It was sitting there in hardback, and I don't see that very often. For hardbacks, he mostly had just best-selling stuff. Some of it was older, some of it was recent, and I'm assuming that he's doing well on like trades. Now, paperbacks consumed the entire left side. Now, this first section was just romance, but I couldn't find any Gothic romance paperbacks that I love to collect. I couldn't find any of those. Then it kind of moves into mystery, suspense, thriller, with lots of Lawrence Block and Robert B. Parker. There was a series installment for the Warkeep 2030 series, and I found some Able Team and Destroyer books. He had some Executioners. He also had one assignment book written by Edward S. Aarons. Now, in this section, I bought a really cool-looking book called Cover. Now, this book is written by Dallas Mayer, but you probably know him as horror author Jack Ketchum. Now, Mayer used the Jack Ketchum name for most of his books, his whole career. Now, the cover, or I should say cover, Cover, is the name of the book, was published by Warner in 1987, and it's kind of like this wilderness survival horror type of novel. In the book, a mentally unstable Vietnam vet moves into the wilderness after his wife and son leave him. And when a group of city slickers decide to camp and have fun near his residence, he's thrust back into the Vietnam War in his mind, and he begins hunting down the campers. Now, this book has been reprinted numerous times, and it's got some really cool covers. The version I bought, not a good cover, but it's 2009. It's a leisure version of it with a guy holding a shotgun. I'm really looking forward to reading it. I love those type of outdoor survival types of books. Vic's Western section was fairly robust. He had lots of old Max Brand mixed in with the newer stuff from the typical William W. Johnstone and Ralph Compton empires. He had Gunsmith, Trailsman, Louis L'Amour, Zane Grey. They all populated this section. But he had some old stuff, too. There was Sundance novels. There was some stuff by Frank Bonham. And a lot of stuff I just didn't recognize. I didn't know the author names. I didn't recognize them. I bought 3 of his Westerns. A 1930 novel by Ernest Haycox called Whispering Range. The printing I bought was the Popular Library reprint from 1949. It's not in terrible shape considering the age, but it looks really good. I bought a Manor reprint of Walt Coburn's 1935 novel Law Rides the Range. And the last one I bought is a 1962 Dell paperback by Wayne Overhauser called The Trial of Billy Pill. Now, his pricing was $4 for each hardback, and he gave you a deal of buying 4 Westerns for $5. I'm honestly not sure how it all worked out. I got 3 Westerns because I couldn't find anything else I really wanted to get, and then whatever the Ketchum novel was because it's kind of in the middle. So I just asked him how much he needed for my wallet, and he said $10. So I don't know how it worked out. Tom knows I'm the worst negotiator on the planet when it comes to buying books or cars or anything. And I'll prove that in my second shopping trip here. So my second shopping trip, my wife and I bought tickets for this really large 3-day music festival in Orlando. It's called Rebel Rock. And we were going down for the Saturday show. It was like 10 bands. And it's one of those deals where you're in the car and you're jacked up and you're headed to the concert. And then the radio DJ comes on and says, "This concert's canceled." Same deal. Only it was a Facebook post that we just happened to read when we stopped at Panera Bread to get lunch. But the two of us already had a hotel booked. We had a dog sitter. The girls were taken care of. So, man, we just kept driving south. So eventually we ended up in Sanford, Florida. In Sanford, there's 2 cool stores there. The first one is called Acme Comics and Toys. And I normally stop in there just to look at the vintage toys because he's got so many like G.I. Joes and Transformers and all kinds of stuff. But I passed by there this time. I made a right at the light, and I hit a store called Best Used Books. Now, Tom and I have both been to this bookstore, and in years past, we sort of cleaned them out on all the good stuff. The last time I was in the store, I think was back in 2018. And at that time, there was this old man running the place, and, you know, he wasn't that helpful. So in 2018, there were boxes and boxes of Mac Bolan books, like Executioner, Stony Man, those Mac Bolan giants. And I could tell these books haven't been touched in a decade. And I think he wanted something like, I don't know, I can't remember. It was like $4 a book or something crazy. And I offered to buy a bunch of them because I was kind of in the mood at the time to read those. So I offered him, you know, to buy a box or so of them if he would just knock half off. So $2 a book. He would get a bigger walkway because these things were like crowding an aisle. He'd get a bigger walkway. He'd get rid of these things, and I would get some books. But he wasn't interested at the time, and those books are still sitting in those boxes in that store. But thankfully, the old man isn't. I don't wish him ill will, but he wasn't there. When I walked in, I could tell the store had changed a little. The old man has been replaced with a nice woman who runs the store. There's also another woman working there and I guess a young, teenage girl working there. She was like stocking shelves and so forth. The store is absolutely crammed with DVDs, CDs, comics, graphic novels, toys, and loads upon loads of used books. Now, maybe the crime-noir books that I saw there have always been there. Maybe I just somehow missed them. I don't know. But I asked the new manager about the changes, and she advised me that the old man I was referring to owns the building. She said that they haven't expanded in physical size, but their inventory has expanded considerably. And she sort of smiled when she said it, and I could sense some pride, which is a good thing. So right across from the counter were 21 Richard Prather novels, bagged and sealed, with marker written on the bag with the price. These were all mostly Fawcett Gold medals and mostly the Shel Scott series. And I have most of these, so I wasn't that interested, but I think the pricing ranged from like $5 to $12 a book, so they were a little bit steep. Right beside of that were two Vin Packer novels. Now, Packer was the pseudonym for Mary Jane Meeker, and she wrote crime noir and lesbian fiction in the mid-20th century. John Frederick Lang Jr.'s fantasy series, Gore, spelled G-O-R, that was lying sort of around the corner from the Shel Scott series. There were 18 paperbacks just sitting there, and they were all in great shape in this Gore series, which I'd like to read at some point. He had two Carter Brown paperbacks, or she did anyway. She had two Carter Brown paperbacks laying there, and a couple crime noir paperbacks by Michael Brett, and I'm not sure which Brett it was because there's several authors that use that pseudonym, and I get kind of confused when I see that name, but there were two really nice-looking crime noir paperbacks sitting there. There were 29 bagged Mike Shane novels, and most of these were all of the Dell variety with a really awesome artwork. 29 of those, all bagged and sitting there, or mostly bagged. There were 3 huge stacks of Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine, and most of these were bagged, and they were all looking in like really good condition. I didn't see the pricing on these. I just kind of skimmed through, but I can only imagine how many great stories are sitting in those magazines. Okay, so listen, I've been running my mouth for like a year now about the Gothic romance paperback genre, and I've just recently got into collecting these, and they're expensive. Sometimes online, they go for $50, $100. These are the paperbacks from the 1960s and 1970s where the beautiful woman is running from the mansion or castle. On one long wall, there's this crime fiction and mystery section. And inside that section, I was able to spot a few Gothic romance paperbacks. It was just a few. I pulled them out to buy them, but I wasn't that impressed with their inventory. I was thinking, well, they really don't have that many. Well, listeners, I was way off, because all I needed to do was just go 3 shelves over, and I found probably the largest collection of Gothic paperbacks I've ever seen in one place. They were stacked 2 deep across this large top shelf. So I counted, and what I could see in the front was like, I want to say 120, 130 books. Behind that is another stack of Gothics, which is about the same height. So I'm guessing maybe around 250 Gothic romance paperbacks sitting there. But they're really hard to get to because you had to pull books down to see what was behind them, and then the whole shelf is being blocked by this large red rack of like bestseller garbage, just sitting there. So I had to move, all this John Sanford stuff and, Nora Roberts or whatever. I had to move all this stuff out to try to get to them. But it was simply incredible that they had this many books sitting there. The science fiction and fantasy section was huge. And again, double stacked with tons and tons of books laying in boxes. The Western section, equally incredible. There was a large end cap filled top to bottom with vintage westerns, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s vintage westerns from the likes of Ace, Ballantine, Fawcett Gold Medal, Dell. You get the idea. But around the corner are even more westerns, and I looked at some of the pricing, and man, it was rough. Like some of the Fawcett Gold Medals that were sitting there, they were westerns, and I don't recognize the name of the author. It was authors I wasn't really familiar with, and they were probably pseudonyms of some awesome author. But some of them were like $20 a book, and the pricing, just like any used bookstore, the pricing's written in light pencil on the very first page inside the book. $20 for some of these books, and I get it. I mean, it's probably close to what some of them go for online, but man, my chase card is like, it can only go so high, so I kind of had to back out of there. There was a ships and boats section with some nautical war books kind of thrown in there. There were 22 Edgar Rice Burroughs paperbacks. They were in pretty good shape. A nice collection of Oz books by L. Frank Baum, and I don't know anything about him, but I probably should. There was a crate, one of those plastic record crates, filled with Savage Sword of Conan magazines. There was another crate near the front of the register, and it was stacked with vintage magazines like Dracula and Close Encounters of the Third Kind. There was also a section for Mad Magazine. So anyway, after all the gawking and walking around and my wife's patience, here's what I finally bought. 2 paperbacks by Richard Ellington. Both have awesome artwork. Both star his New York City private eye, Steve Drake. The first one is Shakedown, and it's on Bantam from 1954. The other is It's a Crime on Pocket from 1950. I got The Velvet Target by Geneva Holden, which was a pen name for Geneva Poe, Poe spelled P-O-U. It's got a beautiful cover, just great colors on it. And it's an ace, crime noir from 1956. I bought Sea Vengeance by Robert Charles Smith, writing as Robert Charles. It's got a great cover by Phil Marini, and it was released by Pinnacle in 1976. I bought Too Late for Morning. It's by Kendall Foster Crossan. He was writing as Richard Foster. Gorgeous artwork, Fawcett Gold Medal, 1960. I bought Down Through the Night by an author named Julius Fast. It was on Crest, year 1956. Richard Matheson's The Shrinking Man, classic horror novel. This is a Fawcett Gold Medal, second printing from 1962. Great cover. And they actually had two of them sitting there, of all things. I got two Marvin Albert books that he wrote as Nick Corey. One is No Chance in Hell from 1960, and Till It Hurts from 1960 as well. Both are Fawcett Gold Medal, and both star his private eye character, Jake Barrow. I bought an old historical fiction paperback with a really cool cover by Robert McGuire. It's called Arrow in the Hill. It's a pocket book from 1955, written by Jefferson Cooper. It's concerning the French and Indian War, and I love those 1700s-styled frontier books. I'm really excited to read it. So, I had probably another 5 to 10 crime noir books, and I had a buggy at this point. They have buggies. So I had a buggy filled, or my wife likes to call it a shopping cart, but I call it a buggy because I'm from the South. So I had like 5 to 10 crime noir books laying in a buggy, and I had to put them back. And I know one of them was like a Signet Cleve Adams book. I think I had like Jeffrey Household, and Lou Cameron was in there, and I can't remember what else I had. A couple of them I just had really cool, crime noir covers, with the detective with the revolver on it. But I just couldn't spend $400 just loading up a buggy. And not to mention, I didn't even get into all those awesome Ed McBain paperbacks with the really cool covers. I didn't even pull out the stack because I knew I was going to be tempted to buy something. So anyway, I put 5 to 10 crime noir books back on the shelf because I wanted them to actually spend money on some of the Gothic paperbacks. Now, just to save time, I'm just going to tell you the title of the book and the author. I don't know who the author really is. I didn't have a chance to research them before the show. But here's what I bought. Circle of Secrets by Claudette Nicole. Scarecrow House by Jeanne Hines. The Chuckling Fingers by Mabel Seeley, which actually looks like a mystery novel more than a Gothic. Heritage of Fear by Evelyn Bond. Diablo Manor by Dorothy Daniels. Image of a Ghost by Dorothy Daniels. The Shadow Wife by Dorothy Eden. Winter Evil by Sharon Wagner. And Kilgarren by Isabel Holland. Kilgarren is Kilgaren. Kilgarren by Isabel Holland. So I ended up spending way more than I ever intended to on a simple trip down to a rock concert. But I tried one of Tom's techniques of talking the manager down on one book. It was the No Chance in Hell book by Marvin Albert, writing as Nick Corey. It's a beautiful book, and it's really expensive online. I mean, you can get it for maybe $10 or $15, but then you've got to pay shipping because it's going to come from Europe, and you're going to pay another $25 in shipping just to get the stupid thing from Australia or England or wherever it's going to come from. So she wanted $10 for this book. And it's been half eaten by moths or whatever. It's in piss poor condition, and I will absolutely be the last reader of this book. It's yellow. Once you read a page, the page is gonna come off, and you're gonna lay it on the table or wherever you're sitting. So I asked if she would just be willing to knock a few bucks off. So she's smart. She hopped on Amazon or Abe or wherever she went to. I think she went to 3 places online. She had her computer right there, and she said she really didn't want to knock any money off of it because it goes for way more online. And she felt like I was getting a pretty good deal at $10 for, this old vintage book. And she realizes that it's in bad shape, and she realizes that I really liked it and that I probably wanted to read it. But she still stayed firm at $10. And I ended up buying it anyway because at that point I'd already spent so much money that I didn't really care about $10 more. So that was my shopping trip. I don't know if I even said the name of this place. So the first place was Vic's Books at the Daytona Beach Flea Market. The second place was called Best Used Books in Sanford, Florida. All right, so I did some shopping, and now it's time for you to do some shopping. It's your turn to buy something. So I'm going to tell you what's out right now for you to spend your hard-earned money on if you so choose. Our friends at Bold Venture Press have the 39th issue of Pulp Adventures out right now. It's $10 for the paper edition or $3 for the ebook. It's got this great Steve Holland cover and mostly focuses on Doc Savage as sort of the lead article. Also, Will Murray traces the Batman's influence on Zorro and the Shadow. There's also an interview with Murray about the Doc Savage involvement, about his Doc Savage involvement, I should say. Of course, there's old and new stories in there. There's old ones featuring Charles Beckham, John Burke, O. Henry Whitehead. The new ones are authored by folks like Brian Beattie, Teal James Glenn, Gary Levisi, Charles Burgess, Adam McFarlane. Again, this is the magazine called Pulp Adventures, published by Florida's very own Bold Venture Press, and it's out right now. Bold Venture Press didn't give me any money to say that. They're not like a sponsor or anything like that. I like those guys. I think they do really good work, and that magazine looks amazing. Also, the brand new issue of Men's Adventure Quarterly is out right now. This is issue number 3, and if you love vigilante fiction, stuff like The Executioner and that sort of thing, Bob Dice and Bill Cunningham have a genuine masterpiece on their hands. There's 2 book bonuses inside of Executioner novels, and there's also an article by Don Pendleton's wife, Linda, who's also an author and editor. So she's got a nice write-up in there about her husband and his dynasty of these Mac Bolan books. There's a feature on vigilante justice by the legendary Chuck Dixon, and 3 vigilante stories culled from vintage men's adventure magazines. So tons of great artwork. Also a gallery of model Betty Page from way back in the day. Anyway, I'm going to review this book hopefully sometime in the near future, but just take my word on it that this is awesome and you totally need a copy, so go buy it. All right, folks, so now it's that special time in the show where I'm going to play some hypnotizing intro music, and then we're going to mosey our way right into today's feature. All right. Today's feature is on a guy that you maybe haven't read, don't know anything about, but trust me, you're going to want to know about this guy, and you're going to love what you're going to hear. Today's feature is on Steve Gould Fisher. Fisher is Fisher. Steve Fisher was born on August 29th, 1912, in Marine City, Michigan. At some point, his family moved to Los Angeles so Fisher's mom could become an actress. Now, Fisher was raised in Los Angeles, and his mom enrolled him into Wananta Military Academy. And Fisher, he had an aspiration to be a writer, and he apparently sold a story to a small magazine, even as a teenager. But at the age of 16, Fisher had enough of school, and he ran away. And just like all these features that we do, where does a guy go that's on the run, has nowhere to live, young guy, rebellious, joins the military. In this case, he joined the Navy, and he served for 4 years. While in the Navy, he was stationed in Honolulu, Hawaii, and he wrote articles for 2 Navy magazines, Our Navy and U.S. Navy. After he was discharged in 1932, Fisher went back to Los Angeles and continued to write for U.S. Navy. In fact, he wrote so much that the Navy officially advertised Steve Fisher as the Navy's foremost writer. Now, outside of the Navy publication, Fisher also started writing original, short, erotic fiction stories, which today I'm sure is probably like just standard romance. But his erotic fiction was published in 1933 and 1934 in magazine format. I think one of the magazines was called Love Revels Magazine. Sometime in the late 1920s or early 30s, Fisher becomes married. In 1933, he moved to Greenwich Village in New York, and he lived really close to the offices of Street and Smith. If you're a pulp fan, Street and Smith, obviously a huge household name when it comes to pulps. They were the dominant publisher at that time. He stated that he really had a rough time early on, and he was evicted several times. Once he was even thrown out in the snow. He pawned his typewriter, and he used rejected manuscripts at lunch wagons, promising that someday he was going to make it big, and these rejected manuscripts were going to be worth money. It's kind of clever. Now, author Frank Gruber moved to New York around the same time, so Fisher and Gruber become lifelong friends, close pals, and that kind of really pushed Steve Fisher in the right direction. So later, Gruber and Fisher became friends with Cornell Woolridge, which we've talked about here on the show many times. In 1934, Fisher's first non-erotic or romance story was published. It was a nautical story called Authorized Mutiny, and it was published in the February 1934 issue of Top Notch. Now, some resources out there say his first non-erotic story was Hell's Scoop, included in the March 1934 issue of Surefire Detective Magazine. In 1935, lowly publisher Phoenix Press published his romance novel, Spend the Night. They also bought and published two more of his novels, Satan's Angel and Forever Glory. 2 years later, in 1936, Steve Fisher becomes divorced. He then marries Popular Publications, Inc. editor Edith Sim. By 1937, Fisher hit his stride and he starts churning out stories regularly for Black Mask. In 1938, Fisher also refined his romance stories and he starts selling those to the slick magazines. What I'm talking about is the big stuff like Cosmopolitan, Liberty, Empire, the stuff that was fairly mainstream at the time. He was one of the few guys who could make a transition from, pulp into mainstream periodicals like that, which I thought was really cool. So now that we have some of his early life revealed, let's get into the series characters, and he had a bunch of them. So let's dive in a little deeper and talk about these recurring characters. The first one I want to talk about is Captain Babyface. This is an aviation pulp series that started in January of 1936. Now, all of the Captain Babyface stories appeared in the pulp magazine Daredevil Aces. This character's name is Jed Garrett, but he's known as Captain Babyface, and he works for the American Special Agent Corps. His mission in the series is to kill Mr. Death, an evil genius working for Germany. There were 10 total stories, and they ran January through November of 1936 in Daredevil Aces pulp magazine. The publisher Age of Aces, which is sort of a newer publisher, they've got all 10 stories combined into one awesome 230-page volume, and you can buy that through Amazon. Next is Fisher's character Sheridan Doom. Doom is a lieutenant commander and chief detective for the U.S. Naval Intelligence. Now, Doom's job is to investigate crimes committed on naval bases, like ships or really anywhere that the Navy worked. Because this is a pulp character, there's got to be some mystery to the character, right? So Doom flies a special black airplane, and his face is monstrously disfigured from a World War I explosion. Now, these stories appeared in the back pages of the Shadow magazine beginning on May 1st of 1935. There were 6 Sheridan Doom stories in the Shadow magazine in 1935. These 6 were the only Sheridan Doom stories published under Steve Fisher's real name. Beginning in 1937, they were all written under the pseudonym Stephen Gould, Gould. In the pulp magazine The Shadow, there were 54 total Sheridan Doom stories between 1935 and 1943. Now, Fisher also placed Sheridan Doom in 2 full-length original novels, 1936's Murder of the Admiral and 1937's Murder of the Pigboat Skipper. Next is a character named Big Red Brennan. Brennan is Brennan. Once again, this is a U.S. Naval Intelligence agent fighting enemy spies in the U.S. and in Shanghai. According to Spy Guys and Gals, who gathered information from the Encyclopedia of Pulp Heroes by Jeff Nevins, Big Red Brennan's adversary is a former American naval lieutenant who sold out to a spy ring of Chinese and Mongolians. There's 24 Big Red Brennan stories, and they ran from October 1936 through December 1937, in a pulp magazine called The Feds. The rest of the series was in the magazine Crime Busters that ran from February 1938 through May 1939. Now, he had a kid detective character named Danny Garrett. Danny Garrett is a 13-year-old shoeshine boy in New York City that solves crimes and catches criminals. His nickname is the Shoeshine Kid Detective. There were 65 of these stories from 1936 through 1946. Nearly all of these are in The Shadow. 2 were in Crack Detective stories and 1 in Mammoth Detective. There were even more Danny Garrett stories during that time written by both William G. Bogart and Fisher under the house pseudonym of Grant Lane. The character was so popular that it spawned 18 appearances in comic book form, beginning with Doc Savage Comics #1 in 1940. This next character that he created is really, really cool. The name is Tony Key, and he appeared in 12 stories in Detective Fiction Weekly and Black Mask from 1937 to 1941. Started with a story called Murder Game with Mirrors. That was in Detective Fiction Weekly, May 15th, 1937. Now, the cool thing about this character is Tony Key works in Hollywood, and he poses as a film and television agent. But his real job is a detective for the film studios. You see, he solves crimes involving producers, actors, writers. He's described as always wearing flannels, white shoes, a white sweater, and a black coat. He has patent leather hair, whatever that means. His secretary and lover is the smart, pretty, platinum blonde Betty Gale, and his ally is Mickey Ryan on the Homicide Squad. I think it's really cool, a cool idea. The character that I've got a little bit more experience with is Mark Turner. He works as the captain of the detectives in Honolulu, Hawaii. He's described as having red hair, a red Van Dyke-styled beard. Because of his brown eyes offset by his red hair, the natives call him Red Eyes. Now, Mark Turner appeared in 5 stories. They were published in The Mysterious Wu Fang, Mystery Adventure Magazine, and 10 Detective Aces from 1935 to 1937. The first of the 5 stories was called Princess of Death, again published in Mysterious Wu Fang, September 1935. My only experience with this character is a story called Horror Over Honolulu, which was in Mystery Adventure Magazine, October 1936. In this story, a leper is attacking young women and somehow infecting them immediately with leprosy. It's kind of crazy. So Turner and a recurring character named Dr. Gunner, they can't figure out how the disease is being transmitted so fast. But the mystery's solved, and it's really far-fetched. This came across as like really pulpy, but obviously that was the idea. It also reflects the time period because, man, the leper leper colony they're like considered like fiends and monsters. So it was kind of rough. There's also a character named Johnny Connell that appeared in 2 stories. The first was Murder Melody, and it was in Detective Tales, June 1941. That same character also appeared in Blues for a Dead Lady, which was in Detective Tales, March 1951. I can't locate any information about the character. I'm not sure what he's about. Now, Fisher wrote about 500 stories for the magazines and pulps, but he also wrote a number of full-length novels. We already made mention of his 3 1930s novels, but Fisher's real payday came with his 1941 novel, I Wake Up Screaming. The novel is about a promoter who's a suspect in the murder of a starlet. The book was compared to Cornell Woolridge, which makes sense considering Fisher and Woolridge were friends. He even has a character in the book named Cornell as sort of a tribute to his friend. The book became a hit and kickstarted it kind of kickstarts this whole crime noir film era in 1941. It was even filmed again in 1953 under the same title. With I Woke Up Screaming, Fisher really made a statement that he had moved on from the pulps. He didn't need them any longer for a paycheck. He had already moved on to, novels at this point. He still wrote them, but he didn't rely on them. Fisher authored 16 total full-length novels, including No House Limit from 1958, which was later reprinted by Hard Case Crime. Now, Fisher moved to Hollywood, California and he began a long-running, highly successful career writing and producing films and television shows. He was nominated for an Academy Award in 1944 for his screenplay Destination Tokyo, which was adapted from his novel. He wrote and produced seemingly hundreds of shows and films all the way up until his death on March 27th, 1980 in Canoga Park, California. Listen, you can browse IMDb and you can just look at the long list. I'm not going to go through all these movies and TV shows. That's probably for another podcast that's dedicated to cinema. But it's a great list, and it just shows how talented he was. For this feature, I want to thank Jess Nevin's Encyclopedia of Pulp Heroes, the online edition. Also, Spy Guys and Gals, IMDb, Woody Halt's blog, Black Mask, and Galactic Central. Now, with all that being said, how about I just throw a few reviews of some of Fisher's stories at you? So the first one is An Order for Murder, March 1936, Popular Detective. Benny Peel is a killer for a dirty politician. For $500, the boss sends Benny to an address, and then bam, bam, a political opponent or lawman is dead. But Benny wants to become a writer of detective stories for the pulps. And Benny is simple-minded, so he tells his dirty politician boss that the magazine he pitched his story to didn't buy his story, his work. So Benny thought it was a great article on the New York crime rackets, and with his experience working for this dirty politician, he's able to really flesh it out. But after the editor declines the story due to poor grammar, Benny sticks a gun in his belly and demands that his story get published. Now, Benny's boss is horrified that the story is going to come out because all of his secrets and underworld connections are going to be exposed by this hapless Benny Peel. So he immediately tells Benny he's got a job for him. He gives him $500 and an address to go to. But as you can probably imagine, Benny's on his way to get murdered. Cool story, really cool premise. Next story, Girl from Tokyo. It's in Cosmopolitan, June 1939. Ben Carter is a Navy lieutenant on an American sub. Now, his crew docks in Yokohama, Japan for a routine assignment. While there, he falls in love with an American woman named Elaine. When it's time for him to leave, she asks if he will resign from the Navy so they can be together and live in Japan. He declines. Now, shortly after, Carter is propositioned by the Japanese to resign from the Navy for a lucrative 7-year contract. They want him to help them build subs, radio communications, and so forth. He declines. So then he begins to think that Elaine is really working for the Japanese, and her affection to him was just all a lie. And the story really surprised me on where it went. It was really, really cool premise. Red is for Courage. Argosy, November 1943. This story was written as a testament to the Red Cross and all their sacrifices they made during World War II. The story was purchased by 20th Century Fox with the intention of an adaptation called Red Cross Girl, but from my understanding, the film never came to fruition. In many ways, this is a classic love story. It's a turbulent and rocky romance using, like World War II battlefields sort of as the backdrop. It's told from the first-person perspective of Willie, a Red Cross volunteer who's serving in battle-scarred Madrid. Willie is best friends with a fellow nurse named Tony, who's also in love with a female nurse named Noelle, who in turn loves Willie. So it's a love triangle, which makes the basis of the book. Both Tony and Willie are introduced to a war journalist named Katie Rogers, and then the triangle becomes a really complicated thing. Now, Willie declares his love for Katie after an eventful and romantic evening. Katie rejects his advances and soon leaves for Paris. The story then takes a fast track, covering a lot of battles and a whole lot of bandages and blood. Over the course of a few years, we follow Willie's progress through the war and his eventual relocation back to New York to become a private practice physician. It's a long but memorable journey following Tony, Willie, Noelle, and Katie's wartime service and their eventual post-war lives. From a romance genre perspective, I thought this was great, but I'll say that there's enough battlefield action here to please fans of this show. In fact, the whole climax of the book is a stirring recount of the Battle of Dunkirk, reliving sort of this harrowing quest to ship soldiers across the canal and away from German forces. That portion was worth the price of admission alone. Overall, really, really liked the story. Now, I do have another Steve Fisher review for you of a novella called Storm on the Island, but I'm going to bring in Tom now with his recording We'll check in, we'll see what he's up to, and then he's also going to do a really cool review for you. And then I'll be back here to talk about Storm on the Island.
Hello, Eric, and hello, Paperback Warrior listeners. This is Tom reporting live from Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates, where I'm living and working for a couple months on an assignment. Want to give you a review, though, of a book I just read that's kind of fascinating, and I want to tell you a little bit about the background. So in 1956, Ed McBain launched his 87th Precinct series with his book Cop Hater, and I guess it must have been a monster hit. I know it certainly was because the series lasted decades and was immensely popular. So let's smash cut then a few years later to 1959. An author that I really enjoy named Lawrence Heller. It's Lorenz, middle initial F, last name Heller, who lived from 1910 to 1956. He was a pretty, I don't know if he was successful, but he was a really good crime writer at the time. And he would write books under the names Larry Holden and Larry Heller. He's from New Jersey. Anyway, he authored 2 police procedural crime novels in 1959 and 1962. One was called Crime Cop, and the other was called Body of the Crime. Now, Starkhouse Press has recently reprinted these 2 thrillers together in one volume, and our friend of the show, Paul Bishop, the host of the Six Gun Justice podcast, wrote the introduction to it. Anyway, I really like Heller's writing, and so what he was doing here was he was trying to create his own version, his own knockoff, I guess you will, of the 87th Precinct stories. So Ed McBain sets his books in a fictional version of Manhattan, and Heller puts his books, and we'll just talk about Crime Cop because that's the one I read, in a fictional metropolis named Hudson. He does a really nice job of kind of mimicking McBain's third-person narrative voice. The cops are Detective Flavin and Gilman. Actually, it's kind of funny. One of the cops is George Gilman, which was a pseudonym later used, just totally coincidentally, for the Edge series of Westerns by an entirely different author in England. Anyway, these guys are cops. They're dealing with your normal crimes, chronic complainers, tips from chatty sources, stuff like that. So one day, amid all this chaos, they get summoned into their boss's office to be briefed on a big case. There's been a series of residential home invasion robberies that resulted in the death of a female homeowner. Now, the homicide guys are working the killing, but they figured that since the motivation of this killing was no doubt a burglary, why not put a couple robbery and burglary guys on it as well, which gives them 2 avenues to solve the crime. So there's some really great police procedural stuff in this book, Crime Cop. When the cops are out there interviewing potential witnesses, there's some interesting police science elements to this whole thing. And so it was, they use clues to solve crimes like any other mystery. But again, very, very good police procedural. Extremely smart legwork by the cops. Very good hard-boiled dialogue. And there's some twists and turns. Everything about this book was just great. It just reminded me of maybe the best Ed McBain 87th Precinct book. Crime Cop was really just Lawrence Heller trying to be a cover band. And thank heaven Starkhouse has both of these books out right now in one volume. You don't have to spend a ton of time searching for the original Pyramid paperbacks. There's this homicide detective in Crime Cop named Ben Tutchek, who's actually the main character in the author's other book, Body of the Crime. What's weird, though, is that Body of the Crime was put out by under the pseudonym of Larry Heller, and whereas the first one was put out under a different pseudonym by the same publisher a couple years earlier. So it was like Lawrence Heller was trying to create this sort of Marvel universe of books tied into the same police department, but his publisher couldn't even be bothered to put them out under the same pseudonym. Anyway, thank heaven Starkhouse had put this out. The book is called Crime Cop by Lawrence Heller, part of a 2-book compilation, I guess, with Body of the Crime, and then after that, the series ended. Anyway, this is Tom from Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. Hopefully, the next podcast, I'll tell you a little bit about the used book scene here, but time is of the essence, and Eric's running a long show. Thanks, everybody. Be cool.
Thanks for that, Tom, and it's great to hear from him, and I'm looking forward to getting back in the same room with him at some point to do more shows. I think he's coming back to the States maybe in November, so we'll eventually get there. So I'm going to review for you a Steve Fisher novella called Storm on the Island. It was published in the July 1938 issue of The American Magazine. So after her father's retirement from the Navy, Myrna invests some of his money into buying the Hawaiian Heaven Hotel off Pearl Harbor shore. She runs the small hotel and she serves beer to the sailors who need a midpoint between the water and Honolulu, so she's kind of in the middle. It's a quiet, peaceful life until the emergency radio begins announcing that a Navy sub has become trapped in underwater debris. So after 3 days of these monotone and grim radio announcements, the men on board have finally come down to losing the remaining oxygen they had. The sub, which is called S-14, is stuck on the ocean floor, wedged in some old wooden wreckage with torpedo tubes that are jammed up. Hoping for a rescue attempt, the Navy sends down divers Harry and Richard. They send them down to the vessel to attempt to clear the torpedo tubes. If they can clear them, the men inside can be safely ejected through these tubes. But the attempt fails, and only Richard makes it back to the surface alive. This third night and last night of this rescue attempt, readers learn that a guest in the hotel has been murdered and their corpse placed in a seldom-used wine closet. Who's dead? Who's the murderer? And how is it related to the sub-disaster? So the bulk of this complex mystery is brought to life when Richard, the survivor from the sub-accident, checks into the hotel awaiting a Navy request and press interviews and all that sort of thing. He needed to go somewhere, so he's checked into the hotel. So Fisher's hotel ensemble is a cast of likely suspects, each possessing a possible motive for murder. It's a traditional mystery complete with a competent Hawaiian detective named Mullane probing for answers. Richard and Myrna strike up a romance, but when Myrna's father is murdered, all fingers point to Richard as the killer. I really enjoyed this short novel and found that Fisher was right in his element with a Navy story set in Hawaii. As we mentioned earlier, Fisher himself served in the Navy aboard a sub that was stationed in Hawaii, so his writing has a really descriptive sense of realism. The romance angle, again, is Steve Fisher's signature. Combining these two ingredients into a hotel murder mystery was just brilliant. Storm on the Island is a captivating mystery with unique characters and an exotic location. Even better is that the story exists for free at archive.org. In fact, every story that I've reviewed for you today, you can get for free right there at archive.org. Go to the little search there, type in Steve Fisher, check metadata as one of the checkboxes, and then it'll give you all the magazines and things like that that are free for you to read right there online with Steve Fisher in it. You can do that for any author. It's great. And that's going to bring us to the end of this episode. And as always, stay tuned for announcements of new episodes. There's probably not going to be an episode for November just due to our day jobs being really, really busy. In the meantime, stay tuned for new reviews each weekday. And I want you to have a happy Halloween and a happy Thanksgiving if we don't talk to you before then. Thanks for now, and bye-bye.